So first off, it turns out that HBO changed their stance. They amended it to strongly prefer. So I'm just going to use screen grabs, no video, and I never use video, but I'm going to use screen grabs sparingly. So we could really break this episode down. This one, I think a lot of fans of the game are going to geek out over this episode. Maybe not when they get to the end, because some changes are made, and we're going to talk about that, and I'm so curious how you feel about it. But 3 locations during the course of episode 2 look exactly like they do in the game. I was even impressed. And I didn't even play the game. I was Googling images. I think I was trying to find out if that museum that they were in actually existed. I think the image that really first blew me away was the Capitol building. But I was like, let me check out the other ones. And I was like, sure enough, the hotel lobby is almost exactly like it is in the game. I didn't see those other locations, though. Some impressive locations in the hotel. The interior of the museum is almost a perfect recreation. And the Capitol building, that was really wow. So bravo, production design team. And Neil Druckmann, who you might have noticed directed this episode himself. That is amazing. Again, his level of access to this is pretty much unprecedented when it comes to adapting things from other areas. Which is maybe why the episode is this episode in particular, I'm not sure if he directs any more of them. And I have to say, when you get to I've only seen 2 more episodes so far, but they do feel a little more cinematic than this one does. This one feels very much like a video game. So it not only looks spot on, but it has the feel of how you move through a video game. So that's one reason I think that fans of the game are going to be so delighted. You know, it's funny, and I'd be interested to know if you're like, oh, you got me, Grace. A lot of people, and I suspect a number of people who are fans of this game give Disney a lot of crap for their live action remakes. But this is pretty much the same thing. It's a strong nostalgia play, in this case, for the game's fan base. But it's very, very similar. It's hilarious. All right, so, and because, again, both are incredibly successful. Even if, I don't know why people have such a problem with the Disney live action remakes. I know some of them have not worked, but the ones that do are so good. All right, so when I, who did not play the games, was first watching this episode before I knew that the locations were almost exact replicas, I did think it was weird that these locations seemed small in scale. I was like, that museum has a weird layout. But when you realize it's like the game, the maze-like layout makes perfect sense. So there are lots of corners and, what's around this corner? Stuff like that. I think the museum in particular felt so much like a game. In contrast, if this was an original show or movie that had a scene in a museum, they would have opened these spaces up, as you've seen in many, many movies, because most museums have open floor plans to accommodate guests and to draw you to the next part of the exhibit. But this was an American History Museum in Boston, and it could be an old historical building that had been converted into a museum, so that would make sense too. But walking around that museum I thought was really interesting, because today, when you go to museums and you see historical exhibits for your own country or others, 90% of the time you're looking at what can be seen as building blocks to today, right? Like, oh, this is how we got here. But here, in a post-apocalyptic situation, you're looking at the remains of a lost civilization. Your civilization is the one that was lost. That's both fascinating and terrifying. I thought that was really, really interesting, because there have been few lost civilizations, which is why so much interest is paid to them. But here, all of civilization was lost. Another element players of the game are going to love is that our trio goes up against some clickers who looked like they, stumbled right out of the game. 20 years later, the Fungus still can't operate humans correctly. They moved and sounded, in fact, so much like velociraptors that this sequence often reminded me very much of Jurassic Park. Although velociraptors, I believe, are smarter. A velociraptor can open a door with the handle. I don't think a clicker could, to be honest with you. I mean, I know they can't see, but they would know to feel around for it maybe. Maybe the Fungus can't access that part of the brain. But then how are they getting into buildings and stuff? I have a lot of questions about the Fungus. We're gonna go through them. We did get some more answers though this week. And of course, Tess goes out with a kiss. It reminded me, I was like, what does that remind me of? And finally this morning I remembered the kiss from the end of Batman Returns. But yeah, that was quite the kiss. And then she went out with a big CGI boom. That looked very CGI to me. For the most part, I thought the visual effects this week were amazing. But there are certain points where you're like, ha, hilarious. That's totally CGI. That wasn't exactly how it went down in the game, though, and there was actually a lot of changes this week. There's a lot of replication of the game, but then there are some significant changes. And I'm very curious to hear how you feel about the changes as fans of the game. Like, for instance, did they kill off Tess too soon? In the game, she was around, I believe, for the first full mission, but they did cut that mission from the storyline. You know, there was a mission within the QZ. When they had to go and look for their, the guy who took their car battery. I don't know if it was about the same thing, needing the same thing, but they were looking for the guy, who was also rendezvousing with the Fireflies, and they went on a whole thing, to go and try and find him and track him down. So that was a mission of Joel and Tess, and so players got to really spend a lot of time with her. But here, they did not. This is, though, kind of, with like some small but significant changes, how she died in the game. And then I'm also really curious to hear what non-fans thought of episode 2, because as a non-fan, while I did appreciate certain elements of this episode quite a bit, overall, I still feel like it's pretty basic zombie storytelling. I'm still not seeing anything that, really says to me, wow, this is a different type of zombie story. And I know fans of The Last of Us will be very upset about that, but I can't help how I feel. And I'm curious if other people who haven't played the game are having the same reaction. A lot of this stuff, I feel like Joel, I've heard this one before. I've seen so many zombie stories at this point. I think also the issue is that I'm not a big zombie fan. I can't get enough comic book stuff, but yet I know some people who are like, I can't take it anymore. So it's interesting. All right, let's go through the episode, and there are chapter times again, because if there's a scene that you want to talk about right now, you're like, oh, I don't want to wait, I want to get to this right now. But let's start at the beginning of the episode. And one of the things I loved was I love the opening. To me, it felt very Contagion. I love that real world element, but also very Chernobyl, showrunner Craig Mazin's calling card. And he did indeed write this episode. He wrote pretty much every episode. And I think he didn't write one. And then I think the first episode, Neil Druckmann co-wrote it with him. But anyway, the casting of Indonesian actress Christine Hakim was perfect. She knocked it out of the park. Wow. Talk about making a very strong impression with just the opening of this episode. Wow. The VFX on that corpse was incredible. And I know that it's expensive, but I wish there was more living mold on this show. When she cut away the skin and the mold underneath was like, hello, I was like, oh my God. It's just, it's just so disgusting and disturbing. I loved it. That to me, those little moments are what make The Last of Us unique. And I wish there were more of them. And then she pulls out the tendrils from the mouth and they reach for her. Ooh, yikes, 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 yikes. She hightailed it out of there and I didn't blame her. The tendrils are, of course, as we discussed last week and are discussed plenty this week, they're new to The Last of Us. And we'll talk about them more in a moment because, as I said, I do have questions. I have significant questions. They're like, we're going to go with tendrils instead of spores. And I'm like, I think the tendrils have problems too, man. So we find out that this did indeed start in Jakarta, which was in the news on episode 1. Well, it exploded in Jakarta. We still don't know how the current patient 0 became infected. They're like, who bit the first person? And the army was like, well, I don't know. And I'm not going to go look for him. And I really think the show, though, is being too subtle about how infection works because all they talk about in this scene are bites. Yet they're also talking about those bites happening at a grain and flour factory because that's how this managed to spread so quickly across the globe, as others have been quick to spot in the past week. Because in episode 1, when you think back, it's Carb City, baby. I did think it was weird there were so many carbs. And I actually didn't mention it in my breakdown, but in my notes for episode 1, I had said, boy, they're eating a lot of carbs. And that's because that's how it was spreading. The neighbors are eating biscuits and then making cookies later that day, which Sarah says, no, I don't want a cookie. I guess touching the flour is okay. But why? I don't know. When you breathe in the flour? Then Joel and Sarah were out of pancake mix, as people have pointed out, and he forgot to pick up the cake, which turns out to be quite fortuitous. But this is something else. And I call the show on this because it's so correctly based in the science in some places, I find it annoying when it's not based on the facts and science as much in other places. I'm like, if your calling card is gonna be the science in this show is real, it better be real. So I looked it up because I was like, does everyone in the world use flour from Indonesia? In fact, they do not. Because, it seemed like this was an outbreak all at once. Like it started out small in Jakarta and then just like boom, right? Everything was happening on that day. That night, planes falling out of the sky. I guess they were having bread service up there. Don't eat the roll, Captain. But, Indonesia isn't even in the top 5 when it comes to worldwide grain suppliers. And in fact, the United States not only is a big producer of grain itself, but our biggest grain importer is Canada. So we wouldn't be getting any grain from Indonesia. So come on, man. So, I think it would make more sense if it had exploded in other places. Again, I guess you could say it's fine, but if this show is going to be the show about this stuff could all actually happen, I found all this out with a quick Google search, man. A quick Google search. And if this fungus can live in grain and flour, how are the fireflies making sandwiches? I wouldn't be eating any bread. Obviously, Ellie can eat it. She's like, yes, I can eat bread. But you think 20 years later, I guess nobody put it together? That seems weird. But you'd think it would be a carb-free society. And that would have been a really interesting element of the show. It's hard to give up carbs. Does anybody knows who's tried? And it's like, this would be a future where there were no carbs. I don't believe you need carbs to survive. So it would be okay. You wouldn't need it. But it would be bizarre. It would be really weird. So I thought so I both am fascinated and also I'm like, come on, step up your game. But I do appreciate the real world science nonetheless, because there is one element that is ripped from the headlines. All right. So this reminded me of this, and I thought this was fascinating and also very sad. Now, I don't know if you saw a news story back in 2021 where room spray was being sold at Walmart, produced in India, which had unfortunately become contaminated with bacteria from South Asia, where, of course, Indonesia is. And it causes brain infections, this fungus, this bacteria. And people were spraying it in their homes. They were aerosoling it, and they were spraying it in children's rooms to do something nice for their children, to make it smell. It was like a lavender smell. And it was so sad because it infected numerous people and killed many of them, including children. So this could very well happen. And it has kind of to a much smaller degree already happened. So again, I like the elements of it being based on the real world so much. The opening scene also does a great job reestablishing the fact that there's no cure. When a doctor tells you your only option is to bomb the city, even though she and her loved ones are in that city, it's serious. And, I thought that the guy who played the army guy was not as quite as good as an actor. I was like, is his lip quivering? You're in the army, man. You should at least at this point trying to think maybe you could get ahead of this. And then we learn later in Boston that they did try bombing all the cities eventually, and it did not really work. They said in some places it did slow it down a little bit, but it really was not effective. Wait till you find out about some of the other countermeasures. All right, so anyway, fast forward to today. And I really love the visuals of this fungus and Mother Earth herself, who created the fungus, taking over the city and, of course, the world. It reminds me so much of Poison Ivy. I love it. And just like we discussed last week, they've been taking that character in that direction in the comics, and I would love to see them do that further, like not just in that little miniseries, but across the board in the Batman universe. And some of you pointed out last week in our discussion that this real world science, because again, this is based on real world science, this would allow Poison Ivy to exist in Matt Reeves' world. Oh boy! Great catch for those of you who said that. I did think it was funny when Joel and Tess, stuck with jerky, and his poor broken hand, trying to tear that jerky apart. I was like, hold the jerky in the other hand, man. Or hold it in your teeth. Use your different limbs, Joel. But anyway, they were eyeing Ellie's huge sandwich. But then again, I wouldn't eat no bread. I don't care if everybody says it's okay. I'd be like, you know what? I wanted to quit carbs anyway. I think this is a really good reason to do it. Less funny, though, as I said, is Joel having hit that guard so hard when he killed him that he says he maybe fractured his hand. Nice subtle acting from Pedro Pascal, not only here, but throughout this entire episode, which is funny because he's so serious here, but he's been extra silly on the press tour, going around telling everybody he's their daddy, like more than once. I guess because everyone keeps asking him about playing the dad all the time, and I think this is an interesting approach to that question. I like it. He's like, I don't want to get typecast, so I'm going to start telling everyone I'm your daddy. If you've seen the clip, you know what I'm talking about. I can't believe he went there. It's hilarious. So as you can see, he's acting here. He's actually a very silly guy in real life. And so he's a very good actor because, you would never think that Joel would say that. Also, Tess tells Ellie that she and Joel are not good people. And I looked into it, and in the game, they are most certainly not good people. And it's been well established by this point in the story. But here, they seem pretty nice to me. I think they do what they have to do, but I wouldn't say they weren't good people, And I actually had this argument online. On Twitter, I tweeted that I was working on this breakdown, and someone was like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that Joel isn't as, brutal as he is in the game. And I was like, yeah, I was just putting that in my breakdown. And then someone responded, and they were like, hello, he dumped that kid's body in the fire pit without flinching. And I'm like, operative word, already dead, kid's body. In the game, I looked it up, he's torturing people for information. He's like breaking arms and stuff. He's like Tess's muscle. And so that's a very different Joel. That's a very different Joel. I mean, I think, again, putting that child's body in the fire, who was already dead, I think really more establishes him as someone who does what needs to be done and just, can just force himself to do it. And that's very valuable in an apocalypse. All right, this episode is also very much like a video game in that we have to go to this location, we have to get from here to there, and we have to take, these are our options as paths. So that was very video gaming. And the sets here, particularly when they were outside, are incredible, outside the QZ, they were incredible. A lot of them practical, it seems. You can kind of tell, you're like, okay, so that's probably all CGI in the background. And in some cases, like that bridge of, on the highway, every car underneath looked like a matte painting. I was like, that looks like a CGI painting. That's funny. But they were really, really good for the most part. The city stuff just really blew me away. And particularly when you could tell they were practical sets. Like the hotel. That restaurant with everything still on the table. I guess there's no need for dinnerware in the apocalypse, but I think this would have been picked clean a little bit more. Like a nuke didn't go off. Society has been devolving for 20 years. And I know a lot of the people that came through got bitten and turned into zombies, but some people did get through. You think someone would show up at the QZ and be like, can I buy my way in with all these drinking cups? I picked them up at the hotel. So anyway, Ellie, by the way, speaking of the hotel, I did think it was fascinating that Ellie had never been in a hotel and never seen one in person before. She said she'd read about them in books. Isn't that funny? I thought that was great. By the way, there are a lot of infections that you can get. They don't all animate your body and turn you into a zombie, but they're pretty freaking serious. So I was surprised they were willing to wade through stagnant water like that, and especially because they'd been through it and had a lot of nicks and scratches on them. I mean, I guess they didn't have a choice, although it turned out to be pointless because they couldn't go that way. But that was like a serious risk. I did love the give and take, though, between Joel and Ellie, where he was like, you're a weird kid. And she was like, you're a weird kid. And I thought their delivery was excellent from both of them. I thought that was a great moment. She is reminding him of his daughter, and you can tell that later when he glances down at his broken watch, thinking of Sarah. Okay, so we learn a bit more about the infected this week. Joel tells Ellie that some infected live for just a month, whereas others can live for 20 years. Wow, what does the fungus do with a body when it has it for 20 years? Are those super zombies like these ones we've seen in the trailer? I mean, I'd be really curious to know, like, what's the difference and what happens to them at that point? Like, what would a zombie want to, what would fungus want to do with it? I don't know what the fungus is doing at all, quite frankly. But, maybe there is a master plan. There could be. Because then we see that there is a nearby hive which has grown a lot because, again, it's been assimilating stragglers who come to Boston looking for the QZ. Some of them don't make it. And Tess explains that they're in that clump like that, and they kind of like do like the wave. Woo! They do the wave. And so Ellie's like, oh, they're connected, not just by a fun time. And Tess says they're actually fungus tendrils running underground. So if you step on one, or apparently, as we later find out, anything even happens near the floor, the closest hive finds out. How does that work? How is the fungus this level of sentient? I mean, I don't think plants work that way. Is there a plant that if you grab one end of the plant, like one leaf, another leaf will smack you in the face? I mean, obviously they don't have that kind of mobility, but I mean, if somebody, maybe, I'm sure there is a chance, based on the science in this show, that someone's going to be like, well, let me tell you about plants, Grace. But I'm not totally buying it as a casual viewer. Is there a hive mind? Is there a queen that runs all this? A queen figure? So again, this show in some places is so scientifically accurate, it's really impressive. And then there's other stuff where you're like, you're just making this up. And again, this wasn't in the game, right? So this is like a new thing they've introduced. The museum. Wow. Talk about a mold problem. Just let the mold have it, which is pretty much what the world did. But yeah, it was impressive. I thought, it was supposed to be dry, so I guess that's why it looked that way. But it looked a little bit more like a theme park attraction to me than real mold, right? Like it was very impressive. Like if you felt like if you were at a really good theme park attraction, you're like, wow, they went all out for this. But it seemed more like it was not real plant or fungus on the walls, but like it was movie, like painted on there or, like carved or molded onto there. But the mold was very dry. Which apparently means that it's dead. So they felt they were kind of in the clear until they saw the fresh kill inside. And they were like, oh man, there's clickers nearby. But they had to keep going because it was the only path left to them to get to the Capitol building. I was really frustrated after they were super clear how important it was to be careful and to be quiet, to be silent, that Ellie seemed to deliberately step on that dead zombie arm. And, it broke and, crumbled under her foot and made a pretty loud noise. I mean, I know that sometimes people like to play around and do stuff like that, but it was really bad to do it in that scenario. It was really bad. And I guess it was in character for Ellie, but, it was bad. Especially since, Tess ended up getting bitten and infected. Now, is that, by the way, I need some clarification on this. I guess the amount of time it took for her to turn was the clarification, but that looks like a neck bite to me. I guess it's technically a shoulder bite because she didn't turn in 5 to 15 minutes and was only starting to, have a tremor when they got to the Capitol building, but looked like a neck bite. Looked like a neck bite. Kudos to that funny sign in the museum, by the way, hands-on history exhibit. I was like, that's pretty funny. But I have to say, for the most part, these clickers, they look just like gross zombies to me, like zombies with weird growths on them. They don't look too plant-like. I wish the plant theme was played up more with them. I thought the acting, though, from Anna Torv was excellent as well here. She also did a really nice job with some subtlety. I rewatched this episode as I do I rewatch all episodes. I watch it first to just kind of like have the experience of how I feel watching it, to have that emotional reaction as a viewer. And then I'll watch it again, so I'm taking notes. I don't like to take notes the first time I see something. So I'm taking notes, and seeing this scene again, the scenes right after the museum hit different once you realize she's been bitten. Although people who played the games will have already known that when they watch this show. But her anger with Joel over being so pessimistic all the time, I think part of it is frustration. Like, she usually lets it go, but since her luck's run out and her time's up, she's like, I'm going to say something. But then also, I think she's worried about him without her. Not only, is she protective of him, but, what will he become? So she's trying to give him, not the most effective way that she could deliver it, but she's trying in her own way, give him some life advice. Try optimism, Joel, okay? She's like, I don't have time to knit you or embroider a pillow for you, so you're just gonna have to remember that I said that. There's also clearly a lot left unsaid between the two of them. I thought that the line that she said where, she said, I've never really asked anything of you. I never even asked you to feel the same way that I do. I was like, ooh, no wonder Joel didn't want to talk to Ellie about their relationship. I thought it was an incredible line. It had so much depth and meaning to it, and it was very sad. It was very sad. Apparently, it's not any easier to date even after the apocalypse. And I think Joel felt bad. I think he was sad when she said that. And you could see the look on Pedro Pascal's face because he's a nice guy. He's a nice guy. And I wouldn't say he exploited her feelings for him, but he clearly never felt the same way. But he was like, it works. I'll go along with it to a degree. And I think maybe he feels a bigger man would have been like, I just don't like you that way, Tess. I think maybe we should go our separate ways. Or I would encourage you to date others. I'm going to go find someone too. But, he kind of did walk that. He didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to talk about it to Ellie. I made them a celebrity couple. Toll. Tess is like, if only we'd been told. So yeah, but that's very realistic to how some relationships are. And so I thought that was well done. It's also an interesting scene here because it's a real-time test that both Ellie and Tess were bitten at the museum. because in the time it takes to get from the museum to the Capitol building, you see that Tess's bite is spreading quickly and Ellie's is actually already healing. Which means, as Tess points out, that means that the hope for a cure is real. And it gives Tess a chance to do something good and meaningful with her life before she dies. More on that in a moment. But first, let's talk about the difference in how she dies. In the game, the Fireflies are all dead when they arrive, just like they all are here. But it's Fedra soldiers who swarm the building and kill Tess. That was an interesting change. I guess it wouldn't have been as interesting as that kiss of death that they had. And they wanted to, I guess, show how the tendrils worked. But in the game, it was Fedra soldiers who swarm the building and kill Tess, but not before she takes a few of them with her. It's a very different version of Tess. This Tess is a good strategist, right? She's sort of the brains of the operation with Joel. Not to say that Joel doesn't have brains for an operation, but he lets Tess take the lead. In the game, she's just as much the muscle as he is. And so I do wonder how fans of the game will feel about that change in her character. So back to the show, when they're in the Capitol building, so apparently what happened was, I didn't really buy what they said happened. They were like, oh, one of them turned and then they all killed each other trying to fight off the turned one. And I'm like, why didn't they spot him as soon as he came in the room? How did they all turn? I mean, it didn't make sense to me. They all would have been taken out like that, but whatever. But so one was still left and he attacks them and they shoot him and he lands on the ground and the fungus tendrils, the fungus hive mind is like, oh no, you didn't, and activates the swarm nearby. I thought like that revenge thing was funny. I mean, obviously you're supposed to think they're like, oh, food, dinner bell, but it did seem like it was for revenge. Great acting from Pedro Pascal in this moment yet again. The horror on his face as he realizes he's losing Tess and he's losing another person close to him in his life. It's obviously not the same level as losing Sarah, but again, he's like, how much deja vu can a guy take? I just had it with the guard. So he's like, I knew I shouldn't have gone outside today. So, and he also doesn't even have time to process it. He doesn't even have time to process it. And you can see him trying to. He's like trying to wrap his brain around it. And he's like, this is so bad. And he just has to force himself to move, not only to save his and Ellie's life, but to honor Tess's last wish, to honor her final strategy, her final plan. Get redemption for all they've done, of which, again, I've never seen, and they seem okay to me. But they're like, let's get redemption for what we've done. Take our word for it. We're badass. And bring Ellie to Bill and Frank, who will know what to do. New mission statement, new video game level unlocked. It is a video game. That's exactly the way it goes. And so Joel just grabs Ellie, like ripping off a Band-Aid, and runs. And to see on his face, on Pedro Pascal's face, the conflict between survival instinct and emotional instinct was amazing. Really, really well done. By the way, speaking of love, there are a few references, and I'm not saying that Joel doesn't love Tess, but he loves her more like as a friend, right? A friend, I'm sure, with benefits, it seems. But he's not in love with Tess, and I think that his remorse over what happens to her is more, I think, very much laced with guilt. All right, so anyway, speaking of, the complexities of human relationships. All right, so speaking of love, there are a few references to Riley here. I don't want to go through them, though, because I don't want to have spoilers for what's coming up. But anyway, we will eventually get to see that backstory of what's happened. But again, fans of the game are going to be like, that's a Riley reference. That's a Riley reference right there. She's talking about Riley. All right, or she's, leaving Riley out. So that's my breakdown of episode 2, The Last of Us. What do you think of how the show is progressing? Both if you're a fan of the game and if you're not a fan of the game. Share those thoughts down below, subscribe today, and be sure to join me next week for episode 3, and you're gonna need tissues. The upcoming episode, destroyed me. I was just a crying mess on my sofa. An interesting way for your Sunday night, so plan your dinner accordingly. But we're going to have a lot to talk about. All right. Share your thoughts again on episode 2 down below. Subscribe today. And of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.